Everybody, is Cast in Court TV with your girl, Miss Public Info. We're here today to talk about the Bryan Kohberger plea deal. Okay, yesterday, as we reported to you earlier in the week, Bryan Kohberger was set to officially put in his plea for the murders of the four college students up in Idaho, Latah County, Idaho University, that dated back to November 13, 2022. Well, yesterday was the day, and he did put in that plea agreement. Now, this whole courtroom scene was extremely tense. We're told that it was packed full of family members, it was packed full of law enforcement, that family members were seen very upset, that there was even a moment where the district attorney in this case choked up, where the district attorney showed emotion. That almost never happens. I can tell you, after spending many years in the district attorney's office, the district attorney is very stoic. They try to do the best they can to seek justice, but they are human, and sometimes these cases get to people, and that is what happened in this case. It was a courtroom packed full of folks, including 30-year-old PhD uh, uh, candidate Bryan Kohberger. He entered the plea of guilty on all five counts. That would include 4 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary. He finally agreed to this after months and months of maintaining his innocence in this case, which I am told by legal experts over at CNN that this case was largely circumstantial. Some of the folks over there in Law and Crime also say the same thing, that maybe the district attorney's office agreed to actually plea bargain this case because of some shaky evidence. Let's get into it. Part of the shaky evidence in this case includes the cell tower pingings. Apparently, when they did the testing for the cell towers on the phone, that his phone pinged, I'm talking about Kohberger, his phone pinged outside of the murder scene, but his phone never pinged inside of that house. And I think what the legal experts were getting at is that what they were afraid of, talking about the DA, what they were potentially afraid of was potential reasonable doubt among a jury pool, that a jury pool may not fully agree that he committed these acts under one, much of the evidence being circumstantial, and two, these cell tower pings not exactly putting him at the murder scene at the time in which these acts occurred. So, Bryan Kohberger coming forward with this plea agreement really actually got all of those things out of the way. Now, this is not a case where a guy is just being unfairly accused of an act. He really did do this. He admitted to committing these murders on yesterday afternoon there in Boise, Idaho, in a courtroom packed full of family and friends of these victims. And part of this had to do with Bryan being afraid of the death penalty. That was what was on the table. The district attorney's office was seeking the death penalty against Bryan Kohberger. I assume that these conversations that he was having with his legal team went something like, hey, we're going to try the best we can to get you the best outcome, but you need to understand that the district attorney is seeking the death penalty. Now, let me educate you guys on how this goes. In this particular case, what was happening is he would go into trial, and the jury would then potentially find him guilty, and then they would go into the sentencing phase of this. And for this particular case, and how a lot of these death penalty cases go, it's all or nothing. The usually when the jury is deliberating, they don't know how many years a potential defendant or a defendant or a potential convicted defendant is facing. They usually just look at the counts, look at what it is, and they judge that and keep it moving. But in these death penalty cases, it is very common for the jury to know ahead of time that this is an all or nothing. You guys either find him guilty and find him guilty, also his punishment being the death penalty, or you don't find him guilty at all. So that is something that Bryan Kohberger's legal team was also looking at, that this was a case of high stakes. I myself have covered the appeals process of two death penalty cases there in Colorado. And I can tell you, these are very high stakes cases. These are cases in which people are literally fighting for their lives. They're not talking about spending decades in prison like some other cases. They're talking about their very life being lethally injected at the end of the day. This is very similar to the James Holmes case, who was also facing the death penalty. This is the Aurora Theater shooting case, in which I was a part of, or covered when I was there in Colorado as the public information officer. That case, it was death penalty from the beginning, but citing some issues that happened in the course of the case's run past my time in the office, death penalty was taken off the table and he was given a life sentence. But this is the exact scenario that James Holmes was looking at. Very similar, and similar to James Holmes. And I think I told you guys in my live when I talked about this earlier this week, that Bryan Kohberger reminds me of James Holmes. Let's take a look at Bryan Kohberger. This is a guy who is 30 years old. He's a PhD candidate over at Washington University. What is going on? Why is he committing these acts? Does he know these people? Did he have prior history with these people? Well, these are things that we thought we would get the answers to as it relates to it coming out during trial. But at this point, we're not going to get those answers because this case will not see trial. He has confirmed and admitted to the murders of 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, 21-year-old Kaylee Calvez, or Goncalves, I'm sorry, mispronounced her name, 20-year-old Xana Carnoodle, and 21-year-old Madison Mogan, taking place on November 13, 2022, there in Latah County, Idaho. Now let's talk about the case in itself and how it was moved. The case was moved from Latah County, Idaho, which is a small little town, or county and town, who hadn't ever, I don't think their police force, I think that at the time it was said that they hadn't had a murder in the town in decades. They didn't even know really where to start to investigate this case. But this particular case was moved out of Latah County and moved into Boise, Idaho for a couple of reasons. Well, the first reason is that the defense cited that they wanted Bryan Kohberger to receive a fair trial. The town is so small, and because it was such a very intimate and personal crime that took place, they didn't feel that he could get a fair trial there. So that's the first reason it was moved to Boise, Idaho. The second reason was the cost of trial. The cost of trial, people don't understand, particularly these murder cases as it relates to death penalty cases. They cost the county and the state millions. They can cost millions depending on how long it takes, depending on the resources that the state needs in order to prove their case. So the legal proceedings that occurred, the guilty plea took place in Boise, Idaho. Now, let's talk about the plea. The plea removes the death penalty, of course, which we've already talked about. After months of trepidation, I'm sure, on the part of Bryan Kohberger and his legal team, whose trial was actually set to go next month. So he waited to the last minute, probably just sort of like his last time, his last chance to actually make a plea for himself to save his own life, because he only had a month left before this thing was going to go to trial. Now, I'm going to read from my notes here. You guys are going to see me look down a few times, but I'm still with you. Now, let's talk about the reaction from the courtroom. So there is a gag on the case, and until that gag is lifted, which is after sentencing, no one can really talk about this case. No one can make any statements about the case or anything like that. It's the same thing we had in the James Holmes Aurora Theater shooting case, because these cases are high stakes. So there are rules of pre-trial publicity. The judge in this case, he understands how serious it is. He wants to maintain the integrity of the case. So they put a gag on the case. That said, that means the state is not talking. The district attorney's office is not talking. No one is talking until after sentencing has completed. But through an attorney, through a family attorney, Madison Mogen's family stated the following, that this case could bring closure. Emphasis on could bring closure, and that they would move on, that it would be all right, but they would move on. This is Madison Mogen's family. Now, Xana Carnoodle's family said that the plea does not bring closure and it does not make everything okay, and that they would never really know what happened, that they would never really know the truth, meaning why this happened, why these kids, and why this location. And then Kaylee Goncalves, a father, he seemed very upset. Sources who were there at the hearing said this. They said that he seemed very upset because apparently he feels like no one cares about the young lives that were lost. He feels unheard. He feels that no one cares about the lives that were lost. And there's a whole lot of emotions that go through this sort of thing when you're talking about, multiple a multiple murder scene. Number one, you're talking about very young kids just at the precipice of their adulthood lives, and then you're talking about a guy who would not, admit to his murder for months and months and months, or years really. This is 2 years in the making. And then now at the last minute has put in a plea of guilt, and the district attorney has agreed to it. And so that can seem very sort of, backhanded to the family. It can. I've been in these rooms with a lot of victims' families, and there's a whole bevy of emotions that go on with these families as it relates to these trials, especially as it relates to murder trials. It's very sensitive, and murders of young people, it's very, very sensitive. Now, among the stipulations of the plea agreement was Bryan Kohberger had to agree to waive his right to appeal. Can't appeal this. You're going to agree to spend the rest of your days in the Department of Corrections for these crimes. You may not appeal. So he had to agree to that. The I there were again tense emotions. Kohberger didn't really seem to have much of an emotional response to anything going on. When the judge asked, how did he plead, or did he do this crime? Apparently, his response was a simple yes. The judge asked if he murdered the 4 Idaho college students in their off campus apartment or home, and he just simply answered yes to each name mentioned or called within the courtroom by the judge. Every time he called a name, did you murder Ethan Chapin? Yes. Did you murder Kaylee Goncalves? Yes. Did you murder Xana Carnoodle? Yes. Did you murder Madison Mogen? Yes. And that was it from him. I'm told he was very stoic, he was very non-emotional, and he just didn't seem to emote any emotion whatsoever. Now, I'm going to look at my notes here because there are there's a little bit of talk about the victim witness statements. 2 seconds here while I get my glasses that fell. Now, the sentencing hearing is set for July 23rd. And after that sentencing hearing is when we'll likely hear from the district attorney's office. We'll likely hear from the family. But some family members we may not hear from. I was also told that a few of the family members have a few documentary deals. So they have a few documentary film deals in the works as it relates to this murder that took place. And that actually sort of bars them from making any statements to the press, because they want to make sure that anything that they say or any thoughts that they have about what happened actually is saved for the documentary. Now, I wasn't told who or how many of the victims' families were involved with this particular project, but just that it was happening, and that was also a stipulation for the reasons why the press wasn't getting any interviews from the families on this. Um, so this is really interesting information, guys. I followed this case. I was awestruck when this case happened. I was personally saddened when this happened because it seemed like this happened for no reason at all. I was very curious and hopeful, just like the victim's family, that we would get an explanation from Kohberger as it related to the crimes, the why this happened, why he did it. Now, listen, the sentencing is set for July 23rd. It will be a time where an opportunity for the families to come and give victim impact statements. Obviously, we know already what the sentencing is, but this is a formality to be written into the record, into the court record. Also, I mentioned to you guys in the last live that there probably wouldn't be immediate sentencing simply because there could be an issue with family members wanting to be there at the sentencing hearing, and they may not have been able to make it to the plea hearing. Also, it could have also been procedural as it related to the judge's docket. He just may not have had time on the docket to accommodate the sentencing as well. But the sentencing has been set for later on this month. And what will happen is the judge will basically put the sentencing into record. He will, make comment. He will make comment on the sentencing, even though everyone knows what it already is. And then the victims, the victims' families rather, they will have the opportunity to speak directly to the judge about Bryan Kohberger. Now, in these circumstances, the victims/victims family in this particular case, they're not supposed to address the defendant, though some of them do. But you're not supposed to address the defendant or, try to be combative or anything like that. You're supposed to speak directly to the judge. But judges are usually very understanding that this is a very high emotionally charged time. And this is something that happens sometimes, just as long as people don't get violent. But of course, we've seen those sorts of things happens where, victims' families, go after the defendant or things of that nature. So, I think in this particular instance, obviously the courtroom will be packed full of deputies who will be, there to make sure that nothing, out of sorts happens. But the victims' families will be able to give their victim impact statements, that's what they're called, and give that to the judge to sway the judge's sentencing, to allow the judge to understand how they feel, to take their feelings